My cousin handed me the glass with a smile and whispered, "Drink." Those 5 words still echo in my mind every single night, a haunting reminder of how quickly everything can change. The crystal champagne flute felt cold against my palm. The bubbles dancing innocently toward the surface, completely unaware they would become my potential executioner. I should have known something was wrong. Marcus had never been the type to personally serve drinks at family gatherings. Hell, he barely acknowledged my existence most of the time, too busy playing the role of the golden child, the heir apparent to our grandfather's empire. But there he was, standing before me in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, that practiced smile, stretching across his face like a mask. The ballroom around us sparkled with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, and the elite of our city mingled in their finest evening wear. The annual Blackwood Foundation Gala was in full swing, a tradition that had been in our family for 3 generations. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night of charity and connection, a showcase of everything our family had built. But in the next 10 minutes, I would be fighting for my life. The liquid in the glass had a strange sheen to it, something I noticed only now in retrospect. At the time, I was too focused on Marcus's behavior, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine, the slight tremor in his hand as he extended the drink toward me. His cologne, usually subtle, seemed overwhelming, as if he'd doused himself in it, to mask the scent of his own nervous sweat. "To family," he said, his voice barely audible above the string quartet playing in the corner. The words came out forced, rehearsed, like he'd been practicing them in front of a mirror. His free hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed brotherly to any observer, but felt more like a weight pressing down on me. I remember the way the light caught the surface of the champagne, creating tiny rainbows that seemed almost magical. How naive I was to think beauty couldn't hide danger. The glass felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained more than just sparkling wine and whatever else Marcus had added to the mix. The sounds of the gala seemed to fade into the background. Laughter became muffled, conversations turned into distant murmurs, and even the music seemed to slow down. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next, waiting to see if I would take that fatal sip. Marcus's smile never wavered, but I could see something else lurking behind his eyes now, something dark and desperate and hungry. It was the look of a man who had made a terrible decision and was watching it unfold in real time. The look of someone who was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. "Go on," he urged, his voice taking on an edge that made my skin crawl. "It's Dom Perignon, the good stuff. Grandfather always said we should toast properly at these events. The mention of our grandfather should have been casual, but there was something pointed about it, something that made my stomach turn even before the poison would have a chance to." I lifted the glass toward my lips, still trusting, still believing that family meant something sacred and unbreakable. The rim touched my lower lip, and I could smell something underneath the champagne's effervescence, something bitter and chemical that didn't belong. But by then, it was too late to stop. The first sip burned going down, not with the pleasant warmth of alcohol, but with something else entirely. Something wrong. It tasted like copper pennies and regret, like the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sweet corruption of betrayal. My throat constricted involuntarily, my body's natural defense against whatever foreign substance had just entered my system. Marcus watched me swallow with an intensity that was almost predatory. His pupils were dilated, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was sweating now, despite the perfectly controlled temperature of the ballroom, Beads of perspiration dotted his forehead, threatening to disturb his carefully styled hair. "Good?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. The word came out strangled, as if he was fighting against his own conscience, as if part of him wanted to snatch the glass away and tell me to run. But that part was losing the battle against whatever had driven him to this point. I nodded, not trusting my voice, not yet understanding that I had just sealed my own fate. The champagne continued to bubble merrily in the glass, innocent and effervescent, while something far more sinister worked its way through my bloodstream. My heart was already beginning to race, though I attributed it to the strange tension of the moment rather than the chemical reaction beginning in my body. The ballroom continued to spin around us, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its center. Guests moved through their practiced social dances, making small talk and writing checks for charity. They had no idea that in their midst a murder was taking place in slow motion, disguised as a simple toast between cousins. But the most terrifying part wasn't the poison itself. It wasn't even the realization that someone wanted me dead. The most terrifying part was what I would discover in the next few minutes about why Marcus had done it, about how deep this conspiracy ran, and about just how alone I truly was in a room full of family and friends. As I felt the first wave of dizziness wash over me, I caught sight of Marcus backing away, melting into the crowd with practiced ease. His job was done. The glass slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a cascade of crystal and champagne. The sound seemed to echo through eternity, a death knell for the life I thought I knew. And that's when I knew I had to fight. Not just for my life, but for the truth, because if I was going to die tonight, I was going to make damn sure I took the bastards down with me. The evening had started like any other Blackwood Foundation gala. I'd spent the better part of 2 hours getting ready in my penthouse apartment, adjusting my bow tie for the dozenth time and running through the guest list in my head. These events were as much about business as they were about charity, and as the youngest member of the Blackwood board, I had a reputation to maintain. My name is Alexander Blackwood, though most people call me Alex. At 28, I was the unexpected heir to a fortune that stretched back 4 generations. My great-great-grandfather had built the Blackwood Empire from nothing, starting with a single textile mill and expanding into real estate, technology, and pharmaceutical investments. By the time the wealth trickled down to me, it was worth more than some small country's GDP. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd never particularly wanted any of it. I'd studied literature at Harvard, dreaming of becoming a writer, maybe teaching, at some small college where nobody cared about my last name. But family duty called, and when Grandfather Edmund suffered his first heart attack 3 years ago, I found myself pulled deeper into the family business, whether I liked it or not. The Blackwood Foundation Gala was held annually at the Meridian Hotel's Grand Ballroom, the same venue we'd used for 15 years running. The space was magnificent, with its soaring ceilings painted with cherubic frescoes and massive windows that overlooked the city's glittering skyline. Tonight, those windows were draped in deep burgundy velvet, creating an intimate atmosphere. Despite the room's enormous size, I'd arrived fashionably late, as was expected of someone in my position. The receiving line had been manageable, the usual collection of politicians, business leaders, and society matrons who attended these events religiously. I'd smiled and shaken hands and made the appropriate small talk about quarterly projections and upcoming mergers, all while mentally counting the minutes until I could politely escape. Marcus had been there from the beginning, of course. As the son of my father's older brother, he was technically next in line for the family throne, at least until grandfather's will had been read 6 months ago. That reading had changed everything, though I hadn't fully understood the implications. At the time, I'd inherited the bulk of the estate, while Marcus received a generous but significantly smaller portion. The family attorneys had explained it as grandfather's way of rewarding merit over birthright, but I could see the resentment burning in Marcus's eyes even during the formal proceedings. Still, we'd maintained the pretense of family harmony. Marcus was 32, 4 years my senior, with the kind of classical good looks that made him popular at these social gatherings. He had our family's signature dark hair and green eyes, though his were harder somehow, more calculating than mine had ever been. He'd always been the more ambitious of us, the one who'd studied business from childhood, who'd networked relentlessly and positioned himself as the natural successor to grandfather's legacy. The ballroom was filled with familiar faces tonight. Aunt Patricia held court near the auction display, her diamond necklace catching the light as she gestured dramatically while telling some story about her latest acquisition. Uncle Richard worked the room methodically, moving from group to group with the precision of a seasoned politician. My cousin Sarah, Marcus's younger sister, looked radiant in a midnight blue gown, though I noticed she kept glancing nervously toward the exits. The charity aspect of the evening was legitimate, at least. We were raising money for children's hospitals across the state, a cause that had been close to grandfather's heart. The auction items were impressive this year. A week in Tuscany, a private concert by a Grammy-winning artist, a vintage Rolex that had belonged to some Hollywood legend. People were bidding enthusiastically, their checkbooks opening as freely as the bar tabs. I'd been nursing a scotch and soda for most of the evening, making my rounds and fulfilling my social obligations. The pharmaceutical division had just secured a major contract with the Department of Defense, and everyone wanted to congratulate me on the deal. It wasn't really my victory. I'd inherited a team of brilliant executives who did most of the actual work, but I accepted the praise graciously enough. The string quartet was playing something classical and inoffensive, the kind of music that provided atmosphere without demanding attention. Waiters moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, their silver trays laden with hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. The champagne was indeed Dom Perignon, as Marcus had mentioned, part of a case that grandfather had been saving for her special occasions. I remember thinking how normal everything felt, how perfectly choreographed the evening had become over the years. The same people attended, wore the same expensive clothes, bid on similar luxury items, and went home feeling virtuous about their charitable contributions. It was a comfortable routine, predictable in its elegance and formality. The conversation topics were equally predictable: market volatility, political developments, vacation plans for the upcoming season. Mrs. Henderson from the Historical Society cornered me for 20 minutes discussing her campaign to preserve some 19th century mansion downtown. Senator Morrison wanted my thoughts on upcoming healthcare legislation that might affect our pharmaceutical investments. A tech entrepreneur pitched me on some blockchain venture that sounded like sophisticated nonsense. Through it all, I'd been vaguely aware of Marcus moving through the crowd, though I hadn't paid him particular attention. He was good at these events, better than I was, really. He remembered names and spouses and children's accomplishments with the kind of effortless precision that made him popular among the older generation. If anything, I'd been relieved that he was handling some of the social heavy lifting. The dinner portion of the evening had been served promptly at 8, a carefully curated menu designed to impress without challenging anyone's dietary restrictions. Seared duck breast, roasted vegetables, some kind of elaborate dessert that looked more like modern art than food. I'd sat at the head table, making polite conversation with the mayor's wife and a museum curator who had strong opinions about contemporary sculpture. It was during dessert that I'd first noticed Marcus watching me with unusual intensity. He was seated 3 tables away, but I could feel his gaze like a weight across the room. When our eyes met, he'd smiled and raised his wine glass in a mock toast, but something about the gesture felt off. Too theatrical, too deliberate. The speeches had been mercifully brief this year. A few words from the hospital administrator about the difference our donations would make, a short presentation about last year's achievements, and my own obligatory remarks about carrying on grandfather's legacy of giving back to the community. I'd kept it under 5 minutes, knowing that people were more interested in the open bar and networking opportunities than hearing me pontificate about civic duty. By 10 o'clock, the formal portion of the evening was winding down, and the atmosphere had relaxed into something more resembling a cocktail party. This was when the real business got done, when deals were discussed over cognac and connections were forged away from the spotlight of the podium. It was also when I'd normally start looking for an excuse to leave. That's when Marcus had approached, me with the champagne flute, appearing at my elbow with that practiced smile and those 5 words that would change everything. At the time, I'd simply thought he was being uncharacteristically friendly, maybe trying to repair whatever distance had grown between us since grandfather's funeral. I had no idea that he'd just signed my death warrant. The first sign that something was wrong had actually come much earlier in the evening, though I didn't recognize it at the time. It was around 7:30, just as the cocktail hour was transitioning into dinner service, when I'd caught a glimpse of Marcus in heated conversation with Uncle Richard near the coat check. They'd been standing close together, their heads bent, in the kind of intense discussion that suggested more than casual family chatter. What struck me as odd wasn't the conversation itself, but the way they'd separated when they noticed me approaching. Uncle Richard had immediately brightened, transforming his expression from serious concentration to jovial uncle in the space of a heartbeat. Marcus had simply melted away into the crowd without so much as acknowledging my presence, which was unusual for him. He was typically the first to glad hand and make small talk at these events. I'd brushed it off at the time, assuming it was some minor business disagreement or family politics that didn't concern me. Uncle Richard had guided me toward a group of potential investors launching into an enthusiastic discussion about our latest pharmaceutical trials, and I'd forgotten about the strange interaction entirely. But now, with poison coursing through my system, that moment took on a much more sinister significance. The second sign had been even more subtle. During dinner, I'd noticed that several family members kept glancing in my direction, their conversations pausing whenever I happened to look their way. Aunt Patricia, usually the most talkative member of our family, had been unusually quiet, picking at her duck breast and avoiding eye contact. Cousin Sarah had seemed nervous, fidgeting with her jewelry and checking her phone more frequently than usual. At the time, I'd attributed their behavior to the natural awkwardness that had settled over family gatherings since grandfather's will. Reading. The inheritance had created fault lines in relationships that had seemed solid for decades. People who had once treated me like a younger brother now approached me with the careful deference reserved for someone who controlled their financial future. I'd assumed tonight was just another example of that uncomfortable new dynamic. But there had been other things, smaller details that my subconscious had registered, even if my rational mind dismissed them. The way Marcus's assistant had avoided serving me during the cocktail hour, always finding an excuse to offer canapés to someone else when I was nearby. The security guard who'd been positioned unusually close to my table during dinner, close enough that I could hear his radio crackling with periodic check-ins. I'd also noticed that Dr. Fitzgerald, the family physician who attended these events every year, had left early. He'd made his excuses during the main course, claiming a medical emergency, but I'd seen him in the lobby afterward, lingering near the elevators as if he was waiting for something. When I'd waved to him through the ballroom's glass doors, he'd looked almost startled before hurrying away. The third sign had been Marcus's behavior throughout the evening. Where he was usually the picture of confidence at these gatherings, tonight he'd seemed distracted, almost agitated. I'd watched him check his watch repeatedly during the speeches, as if he was operating on some kind of timeline. His usually perfect appearance had showed signs of strain, his collar slightly wrinkled, his hair not quite as precisely styled as usual. During my own speech, I'd noticed him standing near the back of the room, but he wasn't looking at me or listening to my words. Instead, his attention seemed focused on the exits, methodically scanning the room's perimeter as if he was cataloguing escape routes. His hands had been clasped behind his back, but I could see tension in his shoulders, the rigid posture of someone preparing for action. The fourth sign had been the change in staff behavior. The waiters, who'd been attentive all evening, suddenly seemed to avoid my section of the ballroom after dinner service ended. My water glass remained empty for nearly 20 minutes, and when I'd tried to flag down a server for a fresh drink, they'd all seemed to find urgent business elsewhere. It was subtle enough that I'd initially blamed it on end-of-evening fatigue, but now it felt like deliberate avoidance. Even more telling was the way the hotel's management had been treating me. The event coordinator, who usually checked in with me multiple times throughout the evening, had been conspicuously absent after 9 o'clock. The head of security, normally visible and vigilant during these high-profile events, was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the usual protective bubble that surrounded me at these functions had quietly dissolved. The fifth sign had been in the guest list itself, though I'd only realized it in hindsight. Several key family friends were missing tonight, people who'd attended every gala for the past decade. Judge Morrison, who'd been a close friend of grandfather's, had sent his regrets at the last minute. The Hutchinson family, longtime business partners, had cited a scheduling conflict. Dr. Chen from the hospital board had cancelled due to illness. At the time, I'd thought it was unfortunate that so many longtime supporters couldn't attend. Now, I wondered if they'd been warned to stay away, or if their absence was part of a larger plan to limit the number of witnesses to whatever was supposed to happen tonight. The people who remained were either part of the conspiracy or far enough removed from our family's inner circle that their testimony would carry less weight. The sixth sign had been the timing itself. Marcus had approached me with the poisoned champagne at exactly 10:15, just as the formal program was ending and people were beginning to mill about more freely. It was the perfect moment for something to go wrong, late enough in the evening that many guests had already consumed significant amounts of alcohol, early enough that a medical emergency wouldn't seem suspicious. I'd also noticed that the hotel's regular medical staff had been replaced tonight. The nurse who usually stood by during large events wasn't at her usual station, and the on-call physician was someone I didn't recognize. When I'd asked about it earlier, the event coordinator had mentioned something about scheduling changes, but now that seemed like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The seventh sign had been in Marcus's choice of location for our toast. He'd maneuvered me away from the main crowd toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where fewer people would notice if something went wrong. The nearest exit was only 20 feet away, convenient for a quick escape if needed. The lighting in that area was dimmer, making it harder for security cameras to capture clear footage. Even his approach had been calculated, I realized now. He'd waited until I was between conversations, when I wasn't actively engaged with other guests who might remember the interaction. He'd positioned himself so that his back was to the room, blocking most people's view of the glass exchange. Every detail had been planned with precision that spoke to extensive preparation. The eighth sign had been in his words themselves. To family wasn't just a toast, it was a message, a reminder of what I represented to them and what my continued existence meant for their own prospects. The way he'd emphasized the word family had carried weight that I'd initially interpreted as emotional significance, but now understood as something much darker. As these realizations crashed over me in rapid succession, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the poison beginning to work through my system. This wasn't a spontaneous act of jealousy or greed. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been weeks, maybe months in the making, and I was standing in the middle of it, completely alone and completely unprepared for what was coming next. The most terrifying part was realizing that everyone I'd trusted, everyone I'd considered family, had either been part of this conspiracy or had chosen to look the other way. The isolation was almost as poisonous as whatever Marcus had slipped into my drink, and it was spreading through my consciousness just as quickly as the toxin was spreading through my bloodstream. The approach itself had been a masterpiece of calculated deception. I'd been standing near the silent auction display, examining a vintage Patek Philippe watch that was generating considerable bidding interest, when I felt someone move into my peripheral vision. At first, I didn't turn around, assuming it was another guest wanting to discuss the timepiece or perhaps make small talk about the evening's success. The charity auction had raised nearly $2 million, exceeding even our most optimistic projections. But then I caught a whiff of that cologne, Tom Ford, Oud Wood, expensive and distinctive, and I knew it was Marcus before I even turned around. He'd been wearing the same fragrance for years, ever since some girlfriend had bought it for him during a trip to London. Tonight, though, the scent seemed heavier than usual, almost cloying, as if he'd applied too much in an attempt to mask his own nervous perspiration. When I finally turned to face him, the first thing I noticed was the champagne flute in his right hand. The crystal caught the ballroom's ambient lighting, creating tiny prisms that danced across the liquid surface. Dom Perignon 2008, if I had to guess from the color and effervescence, part of the premium selection we reserved for our most important donors. But there was something about the way the light refracted through the champagne that seemed off, a slightly different quality to the liquid that I couldn't quite identify. Marcus's appearance was impeccable, as always. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, probably from Savile Row, with subtle silk lapels that caught the light when he moved. His dark hair was styled with mathematical precision, not a strand out of place despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom. But if you looked closely, and I was looking very closely now, you could see the telltale signs of stress beneath the polished exterior. His left hand was clenched at his side, knuckles white with tension. A thin sheen of perspiration had formed along his hairline, barely visible but definitely there. His breathing was slightly elevated, the kind of controlled hyperventilation that comes from adrenaline and anxiety. Most telling of all were his eyes. They had a glassy, unfocused quality that suggested he was operating on autopilot, following a script he'd rehearsed so many times that he no longer had to think about the words. "Alex," he said, and even his voice sounded wrong, too casual, too friendly, with an undertone of forced joviality that didn't match his usual confident demeanor. "Having a good evening? The auction's been quite successful." His smile was perfect, too perfect, like a mask he'd carefully positioned over his real expression. I could see the effort it took to maintain that facade, the way the corners of his mouth trembled almost imperceptibly. I nodded and made some appropriate response about the charity's success, but my attention was increasingly focused on his behavior rather than his words. He kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, a nervous habit I'd never seen from him before. Marcus was usually the most composed person in any room, the kind of man who could negotiate million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Tonight, he looked like a student about to take a final exam he hadn't studied for. The champagne flute remained steady in his grip, though I noticed his thumb was absently stroking the crystal stem, another nervous gesture that seemed completely out of character. The liquid inside continued its gentle effervescence, rising in tiny bubbles toward the surface, completely innocent in appearance. If there was poison mixed in with the Dom Perignon, it was well disguised. "I thought you might like to try this particular vintage," Marcus continued, extending the glass toward me with deliberate casualness. "It's from the reserve collection. The bottles grandfather had been saving for special occasions. Seemed appropriate for tonight, considering how well everything's gone." The mention of our grandfather felt pointed, loaded with meaning that I couldn't quite decipher, but that made my stomach clench with unease. As he spoke, I became aware of the subtle ways he was positioning himself and controlling the interaction. He'd maneuvered us away from the auction display toward a quieter corner of the ballroom where the crowd was thinner and conversations were more private. The nearest guests were 20 feet away, engaged in their own discussions, and unlikely to overhear or interrupt. Behind Marcus, I could see one of the exit doors, its red emergency light casting an ominous glow over the scene. His positioning was equally calculated. By standing with his back partially turned to the room, he was blocking most people's view of our interaction. Anyone glancing in our direction would see two cousins having what appeared to be a friendly conversation, nothing more. The champagne glass exchange would be hidden from casual observation, invisible to security cameras positioned around the ballroom's perimeter. "To family," Marcus said, and there was something in the way he emphasized that word that made my blood run cold. Not to the family or to our family, but simply to family, as if it were an abstract concept rather than the people standing around us in expensive evening wear. His eyes met mine directly for the first time all evening, and I saw something there that I'd never seen before, a hard, calculating coldness that transformed his familiar features into something almost predatory. The glass felt heavier than it should have when I accepted it, though I initially attributed that to the quality of the crystal rather than anything more sinister. The champagne was the perfect temperature, cool but not cold, with a color that seemed slightly deeper than usual. Dom Perignon typically had a golden hue, but this appeared almost amber in the ballroom's ambient lighting. Still, vintage champagnes could vary in color depending on aging conditions, and I had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Marcus raised his own glass. When had he gotten a second flute? And waited expectantly for me to mirror his gesture. His smile never wavered, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his teeth were clenched behind those perfectly arranged lips. His breathing had become even more shallow, and there was a slight tremor in his free hand that he tried to disguise by sliding it into his pants pocket. "Grandfather would have been proud of tonight," he added, his voice taking on a reverent tone that seemed genuine despite everything else about the moment feeling orchestrated. All these years of building something meaningful, creating a legacy that would outlast any of us individually. It's quite something, isn't it? The way certain bloodlines are meant to carry on while others... He let the sentence trail off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. I lifted the glass toward my lips, still trusting in the bonds of family and shared history that had defined our relationship for nearly 3 decades. The champagne's aroma was perfect, crisp and complex with hints of apple and brioche that spoke to its quality and age. But underneath those familiar notes was something else, something faint and bitter that didn't belong. My subconscious registered the anomaly, but my conscious mind dismissed it as imagination or perhaps just the lingering scent of Marcus's cologne. The first sip was small, barely wetting my lips, but it was enough. The taste was wrong immediately, not Just the metallic bitterness I would later recognize as poison, but something chemically harsh that made my throat want to close in automatic rejection. The Dom Perignon's natural flavors were there, muted and corrupted by whatever had been added to the mix. It tasted like betrayal given liquid form, like trust dissolved in acid. Marcus watched me swallow with an intensity that was almost sexual in its focused attention. His pupils were dilated despite the ballroom's bright lighting, and I could see his pulse hammering in the vein at his temple. He was breathing through his mouth now, quick, shallow pants that he was trying to disguise as casual conversation. Whatever he'd put in that champagne, he was clearly aware of its effects and timing. "Good?" he asked, though we both knew it wasn't a real question. The word came out strangled, as if it had fought its way past his conscience and won. His eyes never left my face, cataloguing every micro-expression, every sign that the poison was beginning to work. He was studying me like a scientist observing a laboratory experiment, clinical and detached despite the personal nature of what was happening. The second sip was larger, a normal swallow that sent more of the corrupted champagne into my system. This time, I could feel it burning a trail down my esophagus, leaving a path of chemical fire that had nothing to do with alcohol content. My stomach cramped almost immediately, a sharp twist of pain that made me want to double over. But social conditioning is powerful, and I forced myself to remain upright, to maintain the pretense of normalcy even as my body began its revolt. Marcus stepped back then, just slightly, creating distance between us while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. He was positioning himself for escape, I realized, giving himself room to move quickly when the poison began its more dramatic effects. His own champagne glass remained untouched in his hand, a prop rather than a drink, crystal clear evidence that he had no intention of sharing whatever fate he'd prepared for me. That's when I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to die unless I did something extraordinary to prevent it. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow, doubling the impact of whatever chemical cocktail was beginning its journey through my bloodstream. Marcus, my cousin, my family, someone I'd known since childhood, had just poisoned me with a smile and a toast to family bonds that apparently meant nothing to him at all. The first symptom wasn't pain, it was a peculiar lightness in my head, as if someone had quietly drained half the blood from my brain while I wasn't paying attention. The sensation crept up on me gradually, starting as what I might have mistaken for the pleasant buzz of good champagne, but quickly evolving into something far more sinister. My vision didn't blur exactly, but the edges of my peripheral sight began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. Within 30 seconds of that second sip, my heart began to race in a way that had nothing to do with social anxiety or the stress of hosting duties. The rhythm was wrong, not just fast, but irregular, skipping beats and then hammering hard enough that I could feel it pounding against my ribs. My shirt collar suddenly felt too tight, restricting airflow to lungs that seemed to be working overtime to process whatever foreign substance was now circulating through my cardiovascular system. The metallic taste intensified, coating my tongue and the back of my throat with a bitterness that made me want to gag. Saliva production went into overdrive as my body tried to flush out the toxin, but swallowing became increasingly difficult. Each attempt to clear my throat felt like trying to force liquid past a growing obstruction, as if my esophagus was slowly constricting in response to the chemical assault. Marcus was still standing there, still maintaining that perfect social smile, but his eyes had taken on a predatory gleam that chilled me more than any physical symptom. He was watching me with the focused attention of a hunter observing wounded prey, cataloguing every sign of distress with what appeared to be professional interest. When our eyes met, he didn't look away or show any hint of remorse. Instead, His smile widened slightly, as if my suffering was providing him with some twisted form of satisfaction. My hands began to shake, starting as a barely perceptible tremor that I tried to hide by gripping the champagne flute more tightly. But the trembling quickly intensified, spreading up my arms and making it difficult to maintain my grip on the crystal stem. The glass felt impossibly heavy now, as if it had transformed from delicate crystal into solid lead, while I wasn't looking. When I finally lost my hold on it, the sound of shattering glass on marble seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. The crash brought unwanted attention, heads turning in our direction with polite concern that felt more like curiosity than genuine worry. But when I looked around desperately for help, seeking friendly faces among the crowd of family and friends, I was met with a wall of studied indifference that chilled me to the bone. People were looking, yes, but their expressions were carefully neutral, as if they were observing a mildly interesting but ultimately inconsequential social mishap. Nausea hit me like a physical punch to the gut, doubling me over despite my efforts to maintain composure. My stomach churned violently, rejecting not just the poisoned champagne, but everything I'd consumed that evening. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead and down my spine, soaking through my dress shirt and making my tuxedo jacket cling uncomfortably to my skin. The elegant ballroom suddenly felt stifling, overheated, as if someone had cranked up the temperature while simultaneously sucking all the oxygen out of the air. I tried to speak, to call out for help, or at least to confront Marcus about what he'd done, but my voice came out as nothing more than a hoarse croak. My throat had constricted to the point where forming words was nearly impossible, and what little sound I could produce was lost in the ambient noise of conversation and string music. The realization that I couldn't even scream for help sent a wave of pure panic through my system that was almost worse than the physical symptoms. My vision began to narrow, peripheral darkness creeping in from all sides, like the closing of a camera iris. The glittering chandeliers above became hazy points of light, swimming in an increasingly grey field, and the faces of the people around me started to blur into indistinguishable shapes. Distance became impossible to judge. Marcus seemed simultaneously very close and impossibly far away, as if I was viewing him through the wrong end of a telescope. The coordination between my brain and limbs began to break down in terrifying ways. When I tried to reach out to steady myself against a nearby wall, my arm moved in the wrong direction entirely, flailing uselessly in space before I could correct its trajectory. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, responding to my mental commands with delayed and increasingly erratic movements that made walking a challenge requiring intense concentration. But perhaps most frightening was the growing sense of isolation that accompanied the physical symptoms. As I looked around the ballroom with increasing desperation, searching for someone, anyone who might help me, I began to realize that the careful indifference I was seeing wasn't accidental. The way people's eyes slid away from mine when I tried to make contact, the subtle but deliberate movements that kept them at a distance, the conversations that continued as if nothing unusual was happening, all of it pointed to a conspiracy that ran much deeper than just Marcus and his poisoned champagne. My knees buckled without warning, sending me crashing toward the marble floor with a force that would have been painful under normal circumstances. But my nervous system was too compromised to process pain normally, and the impact felt distant and muffled, as if it was happening to someone else entirely. The cold marble against my cheek was oddly comforting, the only solid and reliable sensation in a world that was rapidly dissolving into chaos and uncertainty. As I lay there, struggling to breathe and fighting to remain conscious, I caught a glimpse of polished dress shoes moving away from me with purposeful strides. Marcus was leaving, his job complete, abandoning me to whatever fate he'd orchestrated. With his smile and his toast and his perfectly innocent-looking glass of Dom Perignon, the sound of his footsteps on marble was the last thing I heard clearly before the poison dragged me deeper into its chemical embrace. The ballroom continued to spin around me, a kaleidoscope of evening gowns and tuxedos and glittering jewelry, while I fought the most important battle of my life against an enemy I couldn't see or identify. All I knew for certain was that if I lost consciousness now, if I gave in to the darkness that was pressing in from all sides, I would never wake up again. And somehow, that knowledge was enough to keep me fighting, even as my body betrayed me in ways I'd never imagined possible. But the worst was yet to come, because what I would discover next would make the poison itself seem like a mercy compared to the depths of betrayal that still awaited me in the shadows of my own family's carefully constructed facade. The revelation came not through any dramatic confession or smoking gun, but through fragments of overheard conversation that drifted to me as I lay semi-conscious on the cold marble floor. My hearing seemed to be the last sense functioning properly, perhaps heightened by the failure of my other faculties, and I caught pieces of hushed dialogue that slowly assembled themselves into a horrifying picture of calculated betrayal. "Is, he down?" The voice belonged to Uncle Richard, though it carried none of the warm familiarity I'd known since childhood. Instead, it was cold and businesslike, the tone of a man discussing a completed transaction rather than the potential death of his nephew. His expensive leather shoes came into view at the edge of my limited vision, positioned carefully to avoid the spreading pool of champagne and crystal fragments that surrounded my collapsed form. "The first phase is complete," Marcus replied, his voice steady now that he no longer had to maintain the pretense of family affection. Dr. Morrison estimated 12 to 15 minutes for full effect, depending on his body weight and metabolic rate. We should have enough time to implement the secondary protocols before anyone thinks to call for medical assistance. The clinical, precision of his words was more chilling than any amount of rage would have been. Through the fog of poison and panic, my mind seized on that name, Dr. Morrison. Not the judge who'd sent regrets, but someone else entirely. Someone medical who was clearly part of this conspiracy. The family physician who'd left early wasn't Dr. Fitzgerald at all, I realized, but had been replaced by someone willing to participate in murder. The casual mention of secondary protocols suggested this wasn't just about the poison, but involved additional steps I couldn't yet comprehend. The will was filed with probate this morning. Aunt Patricia's voice joined the conversation, her words floating down from somewhere above my prone form. The revised documents show clear evidence of mental incapacity, supported by Dr. Morrison's recent evaluations, Alexander's erratic behavior over the past 6 months, the questionable financial decisions, the increasing paranoia. It all builds a compelling case for diminished capacity at the time of signing. My blood ran cold as I understood what she was describing. They weren't just planning to kill me, they were planning to steal everything afterward by challenging my mental competency. The revised will she mentioned would undoubtedly restore Marcus to his position as primary heir, while my death would be explained as the tragic result of a young man's psychological breakdown. It was elegant in its completeness, covering every legal angle while providing plausible explanations for both my death and their inheritance claims. The hotel staff have been cooperative, another voice added. Cousin Sarah, her earlier nervousness, now explained by complicity rather than concern. The security footage from this section of the ballroom experienced a convenient malfunction around 10 o'clock. The backup systems will show Alexander drinking heavily throughout the evening, consistent with someone spiraling into self-destructive behavior. Even my youngest cousin, someone I'd helped through college and supported through her early career struggles, had been turned against me by greed and family politics. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear with each whispered revelation. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity, but a meticulously planned operation that had been months in the making. Every detail had been considered, from the timing and location to the legal aftermath and media narrative. They'd created an alternate version of reality in which I was the disturbed heir whose death was both predictable and ultimately unavoidable. What about the other board members? Uncle Richard's practical concerns continued to flow over my paralyzed form. Jameson and the others won't simply accept the transition without questions. They've worked with Alexander for 3 years and never showed any concerns about his mental state. His worry about potential opposition revealed another layer of the plot. They'd need to manage not just the immediate aftermath, but the longer-term business implications of my death. Already handled, Marcus assured him, with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated every possible complication. Jameson received a very attractive offer from Meridian Industries this afternoon. He'll be announcing his resignation on Monday to take a position with significantly better compensation. The others have been presented with similar opportunities or have already been approached about their concerns regarding Alexander's recent erratic behavior. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the poison as I realized how thoroughly they dismantled my support system. The board members I'd trusted, the executives I'd worked with daily, the advisors who'd helped guide major decisions, all of them had been either bought off or turned against me through carefully planted seeds of doubt about my competency. My professional reputation was being systematically destroyed, even as my physical body shut down. The trust documents are more complex, Aunt Patricia continued, her voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who'd studied every legal angle extensively, but with proper documentation of progressive mental illness, supported by testimony from family members who'd observed concerning changes in behavior, we should be able to establish a pattern of incapacity that predates most of the recent financial decisions. They were planning to unravel years of my life, painting every choice I'd made as evidence of mental deterioration. The most chilling aspect of their conversation was its casual, matter-of-fact tone. They discussed my death and the theft of my inheritance with the same emotional detachment they might use to plan a business acquisition or real estate transaction. There was no anger, no passion, no personal animosity, just cold calculation and pragmatic problem-solving. I wasn't a person to them anymore, just an obstacle to be removed as efficiently as possible. Timeline becomes critical now, Marcus was saying, his voice growing slightly more distant as he moved away from my prone form. The medical examiner will need to be called within the appropriate window to maintain credibility. Too soon and it looks suspicious, too late and decomposition could complicate the toxicology findings we need to support the suicide narrative. Even my death scene was being choreographed for maximum legal and public relations benefit. Through my failing vision, I could see other family members gathering in a loose circle around my collapsed form, their expensive shoes and evening wear creating a surreal border of wealth and respectability around what was essentially a murder scene. None of them showed any sign of distress or regret about what they were witnessing. If anything, there was a sense of relief in their postures, as if a long-anticipated problem was finally being resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The fragments of conversation continued to wash over me, each revelation more devastating than the last. They'd been planning this for months, possibly since grandfather's funeral, building their case and eliminating potential obstacles with systematic precision. The inheritance was just part of it. They were planning to dismantle everything I'd built, everything I'd tried to contribute to the family legacy, and redistribute it according to their own vision of how power and wealth should be allocated. But as the poison continued its work and my consciousness began to fray at the edges, one thought burned through the chemical fog with crystal clarity. If I was going to die here tonight, I was going to make damn sure I took some of these bastards down with me. The only question was whether I could find the strength to act on that resolve before it was too late. The poison was working faster now, spreading through my system like liquid fire that consumed everything in its path. What had started as dizziness and nausea was evolving into something far more terrifying, a complete breakdown of my body's basic functions. My heart hammered against my ribs in an irregular rhythm that felt like it might burst at any moment, while my lungs struggled to process the increasingly thick air of the ballroom. Each breath was a conscious effort, requiring focus and determination. That was becoming harder to maintain as the toxin attacked my nervous system. My vision had deteriorated beyond the simple blurring I'd experienced earlier. Now the world came in waves of clarity and darkness, as if someone was adjusting the brightness of reality with a faulty dimmer switch. The elegant ballroom would snap into sharp focus for a few seconds, allowing me to see the concerned faces of guests who were finally beginning to notice something was wrong, only to fade back into a grey haze that made navigation nearly impossible. The trembling in my hands had spread throughout my entire body, making even the simplest movements a challenge that required enormous concentration. When I tried to push myself up from the marble floor, my arms shook so violently that I couldn't maintain any kind of stable position. My legs were even worse, feeling like they were made of water rather than muscle and bone. The few times I managed to get them under me, they would buckle without warning, sending me crashing back down to the cold stone surface. But perhaps most terrifying was what was happening to my mind. The logical, analytical thinking that had always been my greatest strength was fragmenting into disconnected pieces that refused to form coherent thoughts. I would start to formulate a plan for getting help, only to lose track of what I was thinking. About halfway through, names and faces that should have been familiar became strange and foreign, as if the poison was erasing my memories even as it destroyed my body. Despite the chaos in my head, one imperative remained clear. I had to find help, and I had to find it fast. The casual conversations I'd overheard made it obvious that my family had no intention of calling for medical assistance. If I was going to survive this, I would have to save myself through whatever strength and cunning I could still muster from my rapidly failing systems. The nearest exit was only 20 feet away, but it might as well have been 20 miles given my current physical condition. I tried crawling toward it, dragging myself across the marble floor with my elbows while my legs trailed uselessly behind me. The polished stone was slick with spilled champagne and my own perspiration, making progress even more difficult than it already was. Every few feet I had to stop and rest, gasping for air that seemed to provide less oxygen with each desperate breath. The other guests were beginning to take notice of my condition, but their reactions were far from the concern and assistance I desperately needed. Instead, I saw carefully controlled expressions of polite discomfort, as if my medical emergency was nothing more than a social embarrassment that they wished would resolve itself quickly and quietly. Several people actually stepped around me, continuing their conversations while avoiding eye contact, as if acknowledging my distress might somehow make them complicit in whatever was happening. When I tried to call out for help, my voice came out as nothing more than a hoarse whisper that was immediately swallowed by the ambient noise of the ballroom. My throat felt like it was closing, the muscles constricting in response to whatever chemical cocktail Marcus had fed me. Even when I managed to produce some sound, the words came out slurred and incomprehensible, more like the groaning of someone having a nightmare than any coherent request for assistance. A waiter approached at one point, drawn by the sight of the shattered champagne glass and the wet mess I'd created on the floor. But when I reached out desperately for his help, trying to grab his ankle to get his attention, he stepped back with a look of disgust rather than concern. "Sir, you need to control yourself," he said, in a tone that suggested I was simply drunk rather than dying. "This is a respectable establishment." He signaled to someone across the room. Security, I realized with growing horror. Two men in dark suits materialized from the crowd, moving toward me with the purposeful stride of professionals, handling a routine problem. At first, I felt a wave of relief, thinking that finally someone was going to help me get the medical attention I desperately needed. But as they got closer, I could see in their faces the same calculated indifference I'd been seeing Alavining. These weren't good Samaritans coming to my rescue. They were part of the conspiracy, probably paid to ensure that I didn't receive help until it was too late. "Let's get him out of here quietly," one of them said to his partner, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing waste disposal rather than emergency medical care. "We don't want to disrupt the other guests' evening any more than necessary." They moved to grab my arms, not to help me stand or get medical attention, but to drag me away from the crowd where my death could proceed without witnesses or interference. The realization that even the security staff had been compromised sent a surge of adrenaline through my failing system that temporarily cleared some of the fog from my brain. If the hotel's own security was working against me, then there was literally no one in this building I could trust. Everyone, family, staff, security, probably even the medical personnel, had been either bought off or convinced to let me die without interference. I fought against their grip with whatever strength I had left, thrashing weakly as they tried to lift me from the floor. My movements were uncoordinated and ineffective, like a fish flopping on a dock, but I managed to break free from their initial attempt to grab me. The effort left Megasping and shaking worse than before, but it also attracted more attention from the nearby guests, which seemed to make the security guards hesitate. "Please," I managed to whisper, looking directly into the eyes of a woman in a silver evening gown who was standing close enough to hear me. "Help me. Poisoned." The words took enormous effort to form, and I wasn't sure they were even intelligible, but I could see understanding dawn in her expression. For a moment, I thought I'd found someone who would help me, someone who would call for real medical assistance, or at least create enough of a scene to force action. Instead, she looked away quickly and moved toward the other side of the ballroom, as if my plea had made her uncomfortable rather than concerned. The casual cruelty of that response hit me almost as hard as the poison itself. Even strangers, people who had no stake in my family's wealth or politics, were choosing to ignore a dying man's desperate pleas for help. I was truly and completely alone in a room full of people. The security guards regrouped quickly, approaching me with more determination now that they'd assessed my limited ability to resist. "Come on now, sir," one of them said in a tone that was meant to sound reasonable and concerned, but came across as condescending. "Let's get you somewhere quiet where you can rest. You've obviously had too much to drink tonight." The lie was so brazen, so obviously crafted for any witnesses who might be listening, that it made me want to scream with rage, but even rage required energy I no longer possessed. The adrenaline surge that had temporarily cleared my head was fading, leaving me weaker than before. My vision was darkening around the edges again, and the familiar sensation of nausea was building in my stomach. Time was running out, and if these security guards succeeded in removing me from the public area of the ballroom, I knew I would never be seen alive again. In desperation, I rolled toward the nearest table, hoping to knock something over that would create enough noise and disruption to force people to pay attention. My coordination was almost completely gone by this point, but I managed to grab the edge of a tablecloth and pull weakly. A few glasses and plates shifted, but nothing fell or broke. The minor disturbance drew a few annoyed looks from the guests seated there, but no one showed any inclination to investigate or help. The security guards were on me again before I could try anything else, their hands gripping my arms with professional efficiency. This time, they lifted me bodily from the floor, supporting my weight between them as they began moving toward one of the service exits. To any casual observer, it probably looked like two helpful staff members assisting an intoxicated guest rather than the beginning of my execution. As they carried me away from the crowd, past the elegant decorations and glittering chandeliers that had made the evening seem so magical. Just an hour earlier, I caught one last glimpse of Marcus standing near the main entrance. He was talking casually with Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia, all of them looking perfectly relaxed and social, as if nothing unusual was happening. When our eyes met across the room, Marcus raised his champagne glass in a subtle toast, a final mocking gesture that confirmed everything I already knew about this carefully orchestrated murder. The service corridor they carried me into was stark and utilitarian compared to the ballroom's opulent decorations. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look clinical and cold. The walls were bare concrete, painted institutional white, and the air smelled of cleaning chemicals and kitchen grease rather than expensive perfume and fresh flowers. It was here, I realized, that they planned to let me die quietly and out of sight, where my final moments wouldn't disturb their perfectly orchestrated social event. But as the poison continued its relentless work and my consciousness began to slip away completely, one thought managed to penetrate the growing darkness. I wasn't dead yet, and as long as I was still breathing, there was still a chance to fight back. The question was whether I could find the strength and opportunity to act on that slim hope before it was too late. The service corridor where they dragged me was dimly lit and sterile, a sharp contrast to the opulent ballroom I'd just left behind. As the security guards deposited me roughly onto a metal folding chair in what appeared to be a storage room, my failing mind suddenly snapped into unexpected focus. It was as if the proximity to death had burned away all the non-essential noise in my brain, leaving only the most crucial memories and connections crystal clear. The fragments of overheard conversations began assembling themselves into a coherent picture that was far more complex than simple greed or inheritance disputes. This wasn't just about Marcus wanting my money. This was about something much deeper that reached back into our family's history. As I sat there struggling to breathe, images from the past few months suddenly took on new significance, connections I should have made weeks ago. 3 months earlier, I'd received a call from a private investigator named David Chen, someone who claimed to have information about my grandfather's business dealings. At the time, I'd dismissed it as conspiracy theories, but now his words came flooding back with terrifying clarity. He'd mentioned pharmaceutical contracts with government agencies, clinical trials that had been covered up, and participants who had died under suspicious circumstances. I remembered how agitated Uncle Richard had become when I'd casually mentioned the investigators called during a family dinner. He'd immediately changed the subject and spent the rest of the evening making hushed phone calls. Within a week, David Chen had died in what was reported as a car accident, and I'd received a letter stating that all his files had been destroyed in an office fire. The revised will that Aunt Patricia had mentioned wasn't just about challenging my mental competency. It was about covering up evidence of crimes that went back decades. My grandfather hadn't just built a pharmaceutical empire through legitimate business practices. He'd conducted illegal human experimentation. The profits from those trials had funded our family's expansion, but they'd also created liability that could destroy everything if exposed. My inheritance hadn't just been about money and property. I'd also inherited access to files and records that could expose decades of criminal activity. The offshore accounts, the research facilities, the network of doctors and scientists who'd participated in the cover-up, all of it was documented in archives that only the primary heir could access. They weren't just killing me for my wealth, they were killing me to prevent me from discovering the truth. The timeline suddenly made perfect sense. 3 weeks ago, I'd started asking questions about irregular payments in the pharmaceutical division's quarterly reports. Dr. Morrison, the family physician who'd been replaced tonight, had actually tried to warn me during what I'd thought was a routine physical exam. He'd made cryptic comments about being careful who I trusted and suggested I consider taking an extended vacation. The security guards were talking quietly in the hallway outside, their voices carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "How long does this stuff usually take?" one asked, his tone suggesting this wasn't their first experience with poison-induced deaths. Morrison said 15 to 20 minutes depending on body weight, but it's been almost that long and he's still conscious. "The backup plan is already in motion," the other guard replied. "If the poison doesn't finish the job in the next few minutes, we'll make it look like a heart attack brought on by drug interaction. The syringe is in the medical kit." They had contingencies for every possibility, multiple ways to ensure my death while maintaining plausible deniability. The medical emergency that had called Dr. Fitzgerald away wasn't an emergency at all. It was the removal of the only honest physician who might have saved my life. Dr. Morrison, the replacement, was clearly part of the conspiracy, probably someone involved in the original cover-up of my grandfather's illegal experiments. Even the medical examiner would be compromised, but the most chilling realization was about the scope of the conspiracy within our own family. This wasn't just Marcus acting out of jealousy. This involved Uncle Richard, Aunt Patricia, Cousin Sarah, and probably others I hadn't even identified yet. They'd all known about the family's dark secrets, had all benefited from the blood money, and were now willing to commit murder to protect their positions. The phone call I'd received last week from someone claiming to be a journalist researching pharmaceutical companies suddenly took on new significance. I'd hung up quickly, thinking it was another attempt to dig up dirt on our family for tabloid purposes. But now I realized it might have been someone getting close to the truth about our illegal activities. Even more terrifying was the realization that tonight's gala wasn't just the perfect opportunity to kill me, it was also the perfect alibi for everyone involved. With hundreds of witnesses who could testify to the family's apparent unity and my own apparent mental instability, they'd created a narrative that would satisfy both the police and the media. As the poison continued its work and my vision began to blur again, I understood that my only chance of survival lay not in appealing to family loyalty or seeking help from corrupted authorities, but in somehow exposing the truth in a way that would outlive me. If I was going to die tonight, I needed to ensure that the evidence of their crimes would surface eventually. The question was whether I still had enough strength and time to set that plan in motion before the poison or their backup methods finally silenced me forever. In the growing darkness of the storage room, with my family's paid killers just outside the door, I began formulating what might be my final act of defiance against the people who should have protected me, but had instead chosen to destroy me. The storage room was cramped and filled with hotel supplies, stacks of linens, cleaning equipment, and boxes of miscellaneous items that created a maze of potential hiding spots. Despite my deteriorating condition, I forced myself to survey the space with whatever analytical capability remained. The door the guards had brought me through was the obvious exit, but I could hear them stationed just outside, their low conversation, punctuated by occasional radio check-ins with someone coordinating the evening's events. My hands were shaking uncontrollably now, making fine motor control nearly impossible, but I managed to pull my phone from my jacket pocket. The screen swam in and out of focus as I tried to unlock it, my fingers fumbling across the touchpad with clumsy, uncoordinated movements. When I finally managed to open the contacts list, I realized with growing horror that I couldn't trust anyone in my usual circle, family, business associates, even longtime friends, might be compromised or simply unwilling to believe such an outrageous story. The poison was affecting my cognitive function in waves, moments of relative clarity alternating, with periods where my thoughts scattered like leaves in a hurricane. During one of the clearer intervals, I remembered Sarah Martinez, an investigative journalist I'd met at a charity function 6 months earlier. She'd given me her card after we discussed pharmaceutical industry corruption, mentioning that she specialized in exposing corporate malfeasance. At the time, I'd filed the card away thinking I'd never need such services, but now it might represent my only hope. Finding her contact information required scrolling through hundreds of business cards I'd photographed over the years, a task that proved nearly impossible with my deteriorating vision and trembling hands. The phone kept slipping from my grasp, and twice I nearly dropped it entirely before managing to steady myself against a shelf of cleaning supplies. The chemical smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with the metallic taste in my mouth, creating a nauseating combination that threatened to trigger another wave of violent retching. When I finally located Sarah's number and managed to dial, the phone rang endlessly without an answer. Of course, she wouldn't pick up an unknown number at nearly midnight, especially not from someone whose voice would be barely intelligible due to the poison's effects on my speech. I left what I hoped was a coherent voicemail, though the words came out slurred and fragmented. Sarah, Alexander Blackwood, poisoned at Meridian Hotel, family conspiracy, need help, they're going to kill me. The guards outside were getting restless, their conversation becoming more urgent as they realized the poison was taking longer than expected to complete its work. "We need to move to phase 2, one of them said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin door. "Get the medical kit from the car and call Morrison. Tell him we need the backup solution implemented immediately." The clinical terminology they used made my blood run cold. I wasn't a person to them, just a problem requiring a technical solution. Desperation drove me to explore the storage room more thoroughly, looking for anything that might serve as a weapon or a means of escape. My coordination was so compromised that I knocked over several boxes while searching, sending their contents scattering across the floor with crashes that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. Each noise made me freeze, expecting the guards to burst through the door, but somehow they remained stationed outside. Behind a stack of folding chairs, I discovered a service door that appeared to lead to an adjacent corridor, or possibly an exit stairwell. The handle was stiff and required more strength than I could easily muster in my current state, but the prospect of escape gave me a surge of adrenaline that temporarily overcame the poison's debilitating effects. The door opened onto a narrow maintenance hallway lined with pipes and electrical conduits, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. The hallway stretched in both directions, offering choices I wasn't equipped to make rationally. My sense of direction was completely compromised, and the hotel's layout, which I'd known well from years of attending events here, had become a confusing maze in my poisoned state. I chose the direction that seemed to slope slightly downward, reasoning that it might lead toward a loading dock or service entrance where I could find help or at least escape the building. Moving through the maintenance corridor required enormous effort and concentration. My legs felt like they were made of rubber, refusing to support my weight consistently, and I had to use the wall for support with every step. The concrete was cold against my palm, and I could feel my body temperature dropping as the poisoning continued to disrupt my circulatory system. Each breath was a conscious effort that required focusing on the basic mechanics of inhaling and exhaling. Behind me, I could hear the guards discovering my absence from the storage room. Their voices carried through the service door, rising in pitch as they realized their carefully orchestrated plan had encountered an unexpected complication. "He's gone. Check the other rooms, check everything. He can't have gotten far in his condition." The sound of footsteps and slamming doors indicated they were conducting a systematic search of the area. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and I nearly dropped it in my surprise. Sarah Martinez's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with shaking fingers, hoping I could still form coherent words. "Alexander?" Her voice came through clearly, concerned and professional. "I got your message. Are you really at the Meridians?" "Hotel. What's happening?" The relief of hearing someone who might actually help me was almost overwhelming. "Poisoned," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Family. Trying to kill me, hiding in maintenance corridor." The words came out in fragments, interrupted by my labored breathing and the increasing difficulty of forming syllables with my paralyzed vocal cords. But Sarah seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, her voice becoming sharp and focused. "Stay on the line with me," she commanded, her tone taking on the authority of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "I'm calling 911 right now on another phone, and I'm also contacting Detective Morrison. He's been investigating pharmaceutical corruption cases, and he'll know how to handle this. Keep moving if you can, but don't hang up. I need to know you're alive." Her words gave me hope, but also made me aware of how precarious my situation remained. The maintenance corridor seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, each step requiring more effort than the last. My vision was tunneling again, reducing my field of sight to a narrow channel of dim emergency lighting that wavered and danced like candle flames in the wind. The sound of my own heartbeat had become overwhelmingly loud, an irregular rhythm that seemed to echo off the concrete walls and announce my location to anyone who might be listening for signs of my passage through this underground maze. The sound of sirens in the distance was so faint at first that I thought it might be another hallucination brought on by the poison coursing through my system. But as I continued stumbling through the maintenance corridor, the wailing grew louder and more distinct, accompanied by the deeper rumble of heavy vehicles pulling up outside the hotel. Sarah had been true to her word. Help was actually coming, though I wondered if it would arrive in time to save me or simply to document my death. My phone was still connected to Sarah, though holding it had become increasingly difficult as my fine motor control continued to deteriorate. Her voice came through in fragments as the signal weakened in the building's depths. "Alexander, can you hear me? Police are entering. Stay where you are." The words were reassuring, but I could feel my body shutting down, system by system, and I wasn't sure I could remain conscious long enough for rescue to reach me. The maintenance corridor had led me to what appeared to be the hotel's loading dock area, a vast concrete space filled with industrial equipment and storage containers. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that made navigation treacherous, especially with my compromised vision and unsteady gait. I managed to reach a large shipping container and used it for support, sliding down its metal side until I was sitting on the cold concrete floor. Above me, I could hear commotion in the hotel proper, voices shouting, footsteps running, and what sounded like doors being forcibly opened. The corrupt security guards who had been hunting me were apparently now dealing with legitimate law enforcement, and from the sound of things, they weren't cooperating willingly. The distinct crack of what might have been a taser discharge echoed through the building's structure, followed by more shouting and the metallic clank of handcuffs. Detective Morrison, a different Morrison from the compromised doctor, I realized with relief, appeared at the loading dock entrance with two uniformed officers, their flashlights cutting through the dim space like searchlights. "Alexander Blackwood," his voice called out, professional but concerned. "We received a report that you're in immediate medical distress. Can you respond?" I tried to call out, but could only manage a weak groan that seemed to echo pathetically in the large space. The beam of his flashlight found me slumped against the shipping container, and I could see his expression change from professional concern to genuine alarm as he took in my condition. "Get the paramedics down here immediately," he barked into his radio. "We have a possible poisoning victim, conscious but in severe distress. Tell them to bring everything. We don't know what we're dealing with." His urgency was both reassuring and terrifying, confirmation that my condition was as serious as it felt. Within minutes, the loading dock was flooded with emergency personnel. Paramedics appeared with equipment and supplies, their movements efficient and practiced as they began, assessing my vital signs and establishing IV access. The sensation of the needle sliding into my arm was barely perceptible through the numbness that had spread throughout my extremities, but the sight of clear fluid beginning to flow into my bloodstream gave me hope that help had arrived in time. "Woodies, did they give you?" one of the paramedics asked, her voice calm and professional, despite the urgency of the situation. "Any idea what kind of poison? The more information you can give us, the better we can treat you." I tried to explain about the champagne and Marcus's involvement, but the words came out as barely intelligible mumbling that required careful listening to understand. Detective Morrison was taking notes while simultaneously coordinating with other officers throughout the building. "We have multiple suspects in custody upstairs," he reported into his radio. "Marcus Blackwood, Richard Blackwood, Patricia Blackwood, and several hotel security personnel. We're also looking for Dr. Morrison, the medical doctor, not me, who appears to have fled the scene when the police arrived." The scope of arrests was broader than I'd expected, suggesting that Sarah's call had triggered a coordinated response. The paramedics were working with practiced efficiency, checking my pupils with small flashlights, monitoring my heart rate and blood pressure, and drawing blood samples for immediate analysis. "His vitals are all over the place," one of them reported to someone on their radio. "Heart rate irregular, blood pressure dropping, pupils fixed and dilated. We need to get him to the hospital immediately for full toxicological workup and supportive care." As they prepared to move me to the ambulance, Detective Morrison knelt beside the gurney they'd brought down to the loading dock. "Alexander, I know this is difficult, but I need you to try to tell me what happened tonight." Sarah Martinez briefed. "Me on some background, but I need your account of the poisoning itself. Who gave you the drink? When? Any idea what might have been in it?" His questions were necessary, but exhausting to contemplate answering. Through tremendous effort, I managed to whisper the essential details. Marcus approaching with the champagne, the toast to family, the immediate wrong taste, the overheard conversations about revised wills and cover-ups. Detective Morrison's expression grew grimmer with each revelation, and I could see him making connections that went beyond simple attempted murder to something much more complex and far-reaching. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and medical equipment, with paramedics continuing to monitor my condition while maintaining radio contact with the hospital's emergency department. I could hear them describing symptoms and vital signs to doctors who were preparing for my arrival, their medical terminology washing over me like a foreign language that somehow contained the key to my survival. Sarah Martinez met us at the hospital, her press credentials somehow gaining her access to areas normally restricted to family members. "The police have been very cooperative," she told me, as the medical team wheeled me toward the emergency department. "They're treating this as part of a larger investigation into pharmaceutical industry corruption. Your family's activities have been under scrutiny for months." As they transferred me from the ambulance gurney to a hospital bed, I felt the first real hope I'd experienced since Marcus had handed me that poisoned glass. The medical team was competent and committed. The police were taking the situation seriously, and the conspiracy that had seemed so overwhelming and all-encompassing was beginning to unravel under the pressure of legitimate investigation. But I wasn't naive enough to think the danger was over. People with this much to lose wouldn't give up easily, and my survival represented an ongoing threat to their freedom and fortune. The hospital's intensive care unit became my sanctuary, and prison simultaneously over the next 48 hours as my body slowly processed the cocktail of toxins Marcus had administered. The medical team had identified the poison as a sophisticated combination of digitalis and ricin designed to mimic the symptoms of a heart attack while ensuring a painful and prolonged death. The fact that I'd survived at all was being described as miraculous, though I suspected my youth and generally good health had played a larger role than divine intervention. Detective Morrison visited me as soon as the doctors cleared him to conduct interviews, bringing with him a thick file that represented months of investigation into my family's pharmaceutical empire. What I learned during our conversation shattered even my darkest suspicions about the depths of corruption that had funded our wealth for generations. The illegal human experimentation hadn't been limited to a few isolated incidents. It had been systematic, ongoing, and had continued right up until my grandfather's death 3 years earlier. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and horrifying in its human cost. Government contracts had been secured through bribery and blackmail, with high-ranking officials in the FDA and CDC receiving regular payments to overlook safety violations and approve dangerous medications. Nursing homes, psychiatric facilities, and veterans' hospitals had been used as testing grounds for experimental drugs, with patients who died or suffered severe side effects simply disappearing from official records. Marcus hadn't been the mastermind behind my attempted murder. He'd been a reluctant participant pressured into action by Uncle Richard and a network of co-conspirators who saw my inheritance as an existential threat to their criminal enterprise. The investigator, David Chen, had been getting close to exposing everything when his convenient accident had been arranged, but his research had been preserved and was now in the hands of federal prosecutors building cases against dozens of individuals. This revised will that Aunt Patricia had mentioned was just one part of an elaborate plan to transfer control of the family assets to people who would continue the cover-up indefinitely. Marcus was supposed to inherit my position, but would have been a puppet ruler, with the real power remaining in the hands of Uncle Richard and the shadow network of doctors, researchers, and government officials who had been profiting from the illegal activities for decades. Dr. Morrison, the corrupt physician, not the detective, had been captured attempting to flee the country with falsified documents and a suitcase containing nearly $2 million in cash. Under interrogation, he'd provided devastating testimony about his role in the conspiracy, including details about previous accidents and suicides that had eliminated other potential threats to the organization over the years. My grandfather's own death, I learned, might not have been from natural causes as we'd all believed. The hotel's security staff had been compromised through a combination of bribes and threats, with their families receiving payments in exchange for their cooperation in what they'd been told was a simple matter of preventing me from embarrassing the family through public intoxication. Most of them claimed ignorance about the true nature of the plot, though their willingness to participate in covering up what they witnessed suggested a moral flexibility that made their testimony unreliable. Sarah Martinez had been investigating pharmaceutical corruption for 2 years, following leads that had repeatedly pointed toward Blackwood Industries but had been blocked by legal challenges and official stonewalling. My desperate phone call had provided the breakthrough she needed, connecting her ongoing research with law enforcement agencies that had been building parallel cases against various members of the network. The timing had been crucial. Another few minutes and the backup poisoning method would have ensured my death. The financial implications of the revelations were staggering, with assets being frozen and investigations expanding to include banks, investment firms, and international corporations that had been complicit in laundering the profits from illegal activities. The Blackwood Foundation, which I'd believed was a legitimate charitable organization, had been primarily a money laundering operation that had diverted funds intended for hospital equipment and medical research into offshore accounts controlled by the conspirators. Cousin Sarah, whose nervous behavior at the gala had seemed like simple family awkwardness, had actually been trying to work up the courage to warn me about the plot. She'd been threatened with the deaths of her own children if she interfered, but had ultimately been unable to watch me die without attempting some form of intervention. Her testimony provided crucial details about the planning meetings and the specific roles various family members had played in the conspiracy. The guest list for the gala had been carefully curated to exclude anyone who might have interfered with the murder or asked uncomfortable questions afterward. Longtime family friends and business associates who might have demanded thorough investigations had been discouraged from attending through various pretexts, while those who remained were either part of the conspiracy or sufficiently distant from the family's inner circle to be easily managed. The poison itself had been obtained through the family's pharmaceutical connections, synthesized in a laboratory that had been conducting illegal research for government agencies. The specific combination had been chosen not just for its lethality, but for its ability to mimic natural causes of death, ensuring that even if an autopsy was performed, the results could be explained as a tragic accident or undiagnosed medical condition. Uncle Richard's role as the conspiracy's coordinator explained his nervous behavior throughout the evening and his careful positioning near exits and communication points. He'd been managing a complex operation that required precise timing and coordination between multiple participants, any one of whom could have exposed the entire plot if they'd made a mistake or lost their nerve at the critical moment. The most chilling revelation was that I hadn't been the conspiracy's only target. They'd been systematically eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their operation for years, using methods that ranged from staged accidents to induced medical crises. My survival and the subsequent investigation would likely uncover evidence of multiple murders that had been successfully disguised as natural deaths or unfortunate accidents. As Detective Morrison concluded his briefing and prepared to leave, he made it clear that my cooperation would be essential in bringing the conspirators to justice, but also warned that my life would remain in danger as long as any of the network's members remained free. The people who had tried to kill me had resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to commit murder to protect their interests, making my survival an ongoing challenge that would require careful security measures and constant vigilance. 6 months later, I stood in the same ballroom where my family had tried to murder me, though now it served as a courthouse annex for the largest pharmaceutical corruption trial in federal history. The irony wasn't lost on me that the space where I'd nearly died was now witnessing the final destruction of the criminal enterprise that had funded my family's wealth for generations. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead, but their light now illuminated federal prosecutors, presenting evidence that would send dozens of people to prison for the rest of their lives. The physical recovery had been arduous but ultimately complete. The combination of digitalis and ricin had caused permanent damage to my cardiovascular system, requiring ongoing medication and regular monitoring, but the doctors assured me I could expect a normal lifespan if I maintained proper medical care. The psychological recovery had been more complex, involving months of therapy to process not just the trauma of the poisoning itself, but the deeper betrayal of discovering that people I'd loved and trusted had been willing to kill me for money and power. Marcus received a life sentence without the possibility of parole, though his cooperation with federal investigators had spared him from the death penalty that prosecutors had initially sought. During his testimony, he'd broken down completely, admitting that he'd been coerced into the poisoning by threats against his own family, but acknowledging that fear didn't excuse his willingness to commit murder. His tears in the courtroom felt genuine, but they couldn't undo the moment when he'd handed me that glass with a smile and watched me drink poison. Uncle Richard had died of an apparent heart attack while in federal custody awaiting trial, though the circumstances were suspicious, enough that the FBI was investigating whether he'd been silenced by other members of the conspiracy. His death had eliminated one of the prosecution's most important witnesses, but his extensive records and communications had provided a roadmap to the entire criminal network that made his personal testimony unnecessary for securing convictions. Aunt Patricia had negotiated a plea agreement that would keep her in federal prison for 25 years in exchange for her testimony against higher-ranking members of the conspiracy. Her cooperation had been crucial in exposing the government officials who had enabled the illegal activities, leading to resignations and criminal charges that reached into the highest levels of federal agencies. The woman who had helped plan my murder was now helping ensure that justice was served, though her motivations seemed more about self-preservation than genuine remorse. Cousin Sarah had received the lightest sentence of any family member, 5 years in minimum security prison, due to her documented attempts to warn me and her extensive cooperation with investigators. She'd provided details about family meetings and planning sessions that had been essential in establishing the premeditated nature of the conspiracy. Her children were being raised by her ex-husband's family, far from the toxic influence of the Blackwood name and the criminal legacy we'd all inherited. The hotel staff who had participated in the cover-up received sentences ranging from probation to several years in prison, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with authorities. Most claimed they'd believed they were simply helping to manage a family embarrassment rather than facilitating murder, though their willingness to ignore obvious signs of medical distress suggested a callousness that the justice system had appropriately punished. Dr. Morrison, the corrupt physician, had become the prosecution's star witness, providing detailed testimony about decades of illegal human experimentation and the systematic cover-up of resulting deaths and injuries. His cooperation had led to the identification of hundreds of victims and their families, many of whom were now pursuing civil litigation that would likely bankrupt what remained of the family's legitimate assets. His own sentence of 15 years reflected both his extensive crimes and his crucial assistance in exposing the full scope of the conspiracy. The financial reckoning had been devastating, but ultimately liberating. Nearly 90% of the family's assets had been seized by federal authorities and were being used to compensate victims of the illegal medical experiments and their surviving family members. The Blackwood Foundation had been completely dissolved, its legitimate charitable work transferred to established organizations with proper oversight and accountability. I'd retained enough money to live comfortably but modestly, a fraction of what I'd once possessed, but earned through legal means and untainted by the blood money that had funded our previous lifestyle. The pharmaceutical companies and government agencies that had participated in the conspiracy faced their own reckonings with massive fines, criminal charges, and oversight reforms that would hopefully prevent similar abuses in the future. The case had sparked congressional investigations and regulatory changes that went far beyond my family's specific crimes, creating systemic improvements that might protect future potential victims from similar exploitation. Sarah Martinez had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on the case, though she'd shared credit with me for providing the initial breakthrough that had made the investigation possible. Her work had exposed similar corruption in other pharmaceutical companies, leading to a wave of investigations and prosecutions that were still ongoing. She'd become not just a professional colleague, but a trusted friend whose integrity and courage had literally saved my life. The personal cost of survival had been profound in ways I was still discovering. The knowledge that people I'd loved had been willing to kill me had fundamentally changed how I approached relationships and trust. I'd moved across the country, changed my name, and started a new life working as a high school teacher in a small town where my family's notoriety was unknown. The work was fulfilling in ways that managing inherited wealth had never been, giving me a sense of purpose that felt genuine rather than obligatory. The nightmares had gradually faded, though I still occasionally woke in a cold sweat, tasting champagne and feeling the burning sensation of poison in my throat. Therapy had helped me understand that trauma doesn't disappear completely, but can be managed and integrated into a meaningful life. The experience had taught me lessons about resilience, justice, and the importance of choosing courage over comfort when confronting evil, even when that evil wears a familiar face. Looking back on that night in the ballroom, I realized that surviving the poisoning had been only the first challenge. Learning to live with the knowledge of what my family had done and finding ways to honor the memory of their victims while building something positive from the wreckage of our criminal legacy had been the harder and more important work. The person who had trusted Marcus enough to drink from his glass was gone forever, but the person who had emerged from that trauma was stronger, wiser, and committed to ensuring that such horrors could never happen again. The final irony was that, in trying to destroy me to protect their secrets, my family had instead ensured that those secrets would be exposed to the world in the most comprehensive and damaging way possible. Their attempt at murder had become the catalyst for justice that might never have been achieved otherwise, proving that sometimes the very actions people take to protect themselves become the instruments of their own destruction.